As I resume, I make the point again of the context of this state taxation bill, the huge increase of 80% in Labor taxation since 2013-14, the modest increase in the size of our GSP, the challenges that we face, the plans of the state government to introduce new tax. There's no question that if they are elected, they will put in the big new housing tax, which will add $20,000 to a median house in metropolitan Melbourne, $12,000 in country Victoria. And we know that if they're in coalition with the Greens, that the Greens want double that tax on housing. They want a $40,000 hit on a median Melbourne house price. That is what the Greens have announced is their policy. And I think it's important in that context to see the challenges that the state faces. The context of the new taxes that Labor has introduced over the period, the 8 years of government, the more than 40 new taxes and the massive increases I outlined in stamp duty and land tax and payroll tax, the major taxes, but also the raft of new taxes introduced is an important context. And you know, Daniel Andrews has said to get out of the mire that the state is currently in, we need to grow the state. And of course we need to grow the state. But it's very hard to grow the state when you've had falls in GSP. Victoria's position has been worse than other states with the 263-day lockdowns, much more than other states and the longest in the world. And Victoria, the only state to have a significant fall in GSP. Victoria, the only state to see a massive fall in our population, 44,700 over a year statewide, and a fall in Melbourne's population of more than 60,000 in 1 year. That is a huge drift of population, a fleeing of population from the state. Now, obviously, that's got different components, got natural component in it, it's got overseas migration, and it's obviously got net interstate migration. And if you want to see a clear figure that is a marker to the state's position, the fall in the position with net interstate migration is the clearest one of the lot. It makes, you know, you have to go back to 1997 to see a net outflow of people, and for the 30 years before that. But after that, it turned around and we had significant growth in population by movement from other states and territories. But this year, we had a fall and people more often left Victoria than came to Victoria from other states and territories. So it's very hard to see how the Premier plans growth when he's had actually a record of falling population and people fleeing the state. And obviously tax is not the way to make people come to the state. A raft of new taxes is not the way to do that. You can't tax your way to prosperity. Victoria has become increasingly unattractive to inbound investors, and many who would previously moved here will not. So that is that clear marker that I've laid out and the clear position. We've obviously said there needs to be a focus on recovering and rebuilding. Our commitment to no new taxes, and this bill, this state taxation bill, as I've outlined, is actually a modest bill in itself, but in the context of recent years of massive tax hikes, massive tax take increases, 80% tax increase across the period of this government, state tax increase. It's a huge hit on the living standards of Victorians, and a huge hit that feeds directly through into the cost of living for everyday Victorians. And, you know, I could use many, many examples. The land tax that is applied to power lines on state land. That land tax is fed directly through into the price of electricity. So we've seen in recent months an increase in electricity charges with a straight flow through from the increased land tax that the state government has clobbered the electricity providers with. Now, you know, the state government is desperate for revenue. They'll grab it anywhere they can, but that is a straight feed through, a straight cost that goes and touches everyday Victorian households and everyday Victorian businesses. It is true that the growth, Acting President, it is true that the growth also has to centre around productivity, and the productivity record in Victoria is shocking. We've seen productivity drift over the last 8 years. in the period from 95, 96 to 99, 2000, productivity rose by 3.66%. But between 2001 and 2009-10, Labor productivity stalled at a third of that rate, 1.66%, and over the period 2010-11 to 2019-20, Labor productivity slipped even further to 0.9%. You can't actually get ahead if you've got declining productivity or static productivity, and that is a very bad outcome for Victoria. The latest ABS figures show per capita data shows Victoria's flat economic performance. GSP in June 2014 was $68,457 per person. 7 years later, GSP in June 2021 was $70,292, a measly increase of $1,835 per person. This compares to the increase in GSP under the Kennett Liberal government of $13,491 between 92 and 99. Relative to other states, Victoria's GSP per capita at $70,292 is the third lowest of all states and territories, well behind New South Wales at $77,532 and well behind the national average of $78,245. For Victoria's economy to improve, it's got to get its GSP up and GSP per capita. It's important, I think, in this context to look at the impacts of state government regulations and controls that have often been counterproductive. VECI had its Cost and Ease of Doing Business task force, and I pay tribute to the work that task force has done, and they produced a critical paper laying out the productivity problem in Victoria. And they said, Victoria has a productivity challenge that started well before the pandemic. Note this, well before the pandemic. Labor likes to point at the pandemic. No. The debt was already up. We were already in deficit on the 31st of December 2019. The state was in deficit. The big project blowouts were locked and loaded, and they were careering out of control. We already had the problems with the metro. We had the problems with the Westgate Tunnel, and I could go on. And at the time, of course, it's very clear that Melbourne was heading and Victoria was heading in the wrong direction. The Committee for Melbourne in its recent international benchmarking study recognised the same problem, saying GDP per capita in Melbourne is now 20% below its peer group average, while household disposable income has also fallen relative to others. That is an international benchmarking exercise by the Committee for Melbourne, and it's an important benchmarking exercise. And should not be thought that, because Australia, and I don't deny that Australia more generally has a productivity problem, but Victoria's performance is not excused by that, and it is actually, as I've already outlined, a laggard performer in national productivity performance. Income per head has hardly moved. It's no wonder that Victorian families are actually worried about the cost of living with rising prices and stagnant income under Daniel Andrews. They have every right to be angry. That is the achievement of Labor in Victoria. The VECI survey, and I again pay tribute to the detailed work that was done by VECI, said doing business in Victoria is harder than it needs to be, not just financially, but in terms of time demands and stress. Nearly 40% of Victorian businesses say time is a bigger cost to doing business than money. This shows that some aspects of government regulations and approach to regulation are cumbersome and poorly administered. Pressures on business owners are particularly acute in parts of regional Victoria. Importantly, the most significant costs faced by Victorian businesses were present well before March 2020 and are likely to persist well beyond the COVID-19 recovery. So I make that point that the way to have greater tax revenue is to grow the economy. You've got to grow the economy. We do need some targeted population support to businesses in particular areas of high technical need and others, but we also do need to focus on actually lifting the productivity of the state, rather than just simply taxing our way out of these problems, because taxing is not the way to deal with these challenges that the state faces. I think Victoria does need to go forward with this way, and that is why we've outlined a productivity commission Victorian Productivity Commission. We actually think that Victoria is remiss in not having a body of this nature, a body that is equivalent to the one in New South Wales or the national body or South Australia. And the challenge is there, I think, for us to look at ways of growing the pie, growing the outcome for the whole community, and doing that in a collaborative and thoughtful way. And a Productivity Commission in Victoria can be part of achieving that. Early reports of the Productivity Commission could begin to look at a number of really significant ways forward. I want to just return to some of the sharp tax points that we've made. Concurrent with this budget, on the 2nd of May, the state government virtually doubled the charges on building firms, builders, building surveyors, and indeed there's a raft of others to be regulated and registered over the next period. Now, we say that huge increase is unjustified. It's another new tax directly on builders. It's another new tax on the building and construction industry. And those taxes are obviously passed through to consumers in the end, pushing up housing prices, making houses much less affordable. We've said the state government it's done it by regulation. It's not something that we can easily stop. But we've certainly called for a return to the previous levels of charge. And it's clear that would be a significant help. Of course, it's the wrong time to be putting additional charges on building and construction. I think the state government has not thought through what is happening in the sector at the moment with the increases in prices, the increases in steel and wood and other inputs, as well as the labour shortages that are significant points as well. So the wrong time to put on new harsh regulations and new charges. We've heard what Becky has said about the challenge of regulation in the state. We need to be smarter in the way we do this. We can't simply jack up tax. And as I said, in the context of this bill, which in itself is a modest bill, and many of the measures in it, as I've indicated, are supported by the opposition, but in the context of the way tax has been jacked up over the last 8 years across a wide front, huge increases in stamp duty, huge increases in land tax, huge increases in payroll tax, and more than 40 new and expanded taxes put in place in direct breach of Daniel Andrews' promise in 2014, and indeed the Treasurer's promise. The Treasurer made a similar promise in 2014, which he too has breached. And that set of facts is an important set of facts. People need to understand the context of the state government's taxing policy. They need to understand the impact that it is having on the state's economy, the impact that it is having on the state's competitiveness. So yes, we need to grow the state. Absolutely. We can grow it in targeted population growth. We need to turn around the population that's been fleeing the state. That is what has been actually happening over the last 18 months under this government. Unlike other states, Victoria's population has fled in big numbers. As I said before, 44,700 statewide was the fall to the 30th of June last year, and the fall in Melbourne's population was 60,500. These are significant markers to the failures by the state government, the failure in Victoria, and that stands in stark contrast to every other state and territory in the nation. And you can't expect an economy to grow, you can't expect an economy to come out and get to a durable position where it can actually provide in the way it should for families and businesses if you've got these very high taxes and very heavy regulations. That's why we need to think more carefully about the way we do these things. That's why we need to focus on lifting productivity in a collaborative way. That's why we need to focus on ensuring that the population that's fleeing the state is turned around, and that's why we need to focus on maintaining a low-tax state, a state that doesn't stand out for all the wrong reasons.